Again, thank you so much for coming. My name is Sarah. If you have questions, I work here at the Ridgewood Public Library in the Bolger Heritage Center. Bolger Heritage Center offers a lot of programming on local history and genealogy. So if you go to the Ridgewood Library website and check out the local history and genealogy tab, you'll see a lot of the resources that we can offer, especially in the virtual world that we're all living in at the moment. But to get started, our guest speaker tonight is Stacy Taranto, who is an associate professor of history at Ramapo College of New Jersey, where her teaching and research focus on post-1945 US political and women's history. She earned an AB in history from Duke University in 2001, and an AM in 2005, and a PhD in 2010 in history from Brown University. She is co-editor of a new collection entitled Suffrage at 100, Women in American Politics Since 1920, which was published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2020. Her first book, Kitchen Table Politics, Conservative Women and Family Values in New York, which was published by University of Pennsylvania Press in 2017, won the 2017 Arine Custer Memorial Award. Taranto is the author of several scholarly articles, and her popular writing and commentary have appeared in Nursing Clio, The Atlantic, Time, and often in the Made by History section of the Washington Post, including an article about the election in this past week. So thank you everybody for joining us today. And my first question for Stacy is, can you tell me about the process of writing this book? What kind of book is this, and what gave you the idea to put the collection together?
Great. Well, first, hopefully everyone can hear me. I always say to my students, and thank you. It's so great to see so many familiar faces, and a huge thank you to the Bolger Center and to Sarah for inviting me. And you also invited me for my first book, and it's just lovely to live in a community that puts a spotlight on local historical work. So thank you. Yeah, so this is a different kind of book. This is kind of a book that, with my co-editor, Leandra Zarno, she's a professor at University of Houston, and she's sorry she can't be here tonight, but she and I have kind of been talking about this book for maybe like 15 years. Leandra and I met very appropriately for historians in an archive. We were graduate students, she at UC Santa Barbara and I was at Brown, and we both met at the Columbia Reading Room where we were looking at Bella Abzug's papers. Bella Abzug was a Democratic representative from New York City. Folks may remember her name. She is one of the leading feminists that was in Congress helping to pass really groundbreaking legislation in the early 70s. Leandra was doing a dissertation on Bella Abzug, which became a book that just came out from Harvard Press this year. Great book on Bella Abzug. If anyone watched Mrs. America, the Hulu show, you might be interested in reading Leandra's book. Anyways, I was in the archive also looking at Bella Abzug's papers. And Leandra, you know, when you're a graduate student, you have no idea if someone else is doing the exact same dissertation as you. And that's always the worry, especially this was before social media. This is in the early 2000s. And so Leandra was kind of suspiciously looking at me, you know, why are you looking at Bella Abzug's papers? You look like a graduate student. And it turns out I was writing about the anti-feminist opponents who were writing nasty letters to Bella Abzug. So we definitely were doing different things. But one thing that struck us was that in the 1970s, you know, she's writing about a feminist legislator who's trying to move the Democratic Party leftwards. I was writing about Phyllis Schlafly and conservative women who were trying to move the Republican Party away from their embrace of feminism and towards the right. And yet women on, you know, opposite ends of the political spectrum, they were united in thinking that more women needed to be in politics. And this is sort of a universal thing that women have been saying since the birth of the nation, I guess, that more women need to be in politics, regardless of their ideological affiliation. I mean, just most recently, you heard a member of QAnon who was elected as a Republican, and she was saying that. And then, of course, you see, you know, AOC on the other end of the spectrum also is saying that women need more representation. So we've really, having studied women on opposite ends 50 years ago, we were really struck by women in politics and sort of studying that history. And so in the summer of 2018, Leandra and I are both big politicos, and we were watching the same news that came out of the Women's March of 2017 about a historic number of women running for office in 2018, which became the historic, although it was just eclipsed, election of women in the 2018 midterms. She and I were both wrapping up our first books, and I said, Leandra, before you know it, it's going to be the centennial, the 100th anniversary of the suffrage amendment 2 years from now. And we've been talking about, trying to put together, sketch out the history of women in American politics, especially since they got the vote. And we've been talking about specifically how they've struggled, regardless of party affiliation, to really translate voting power into political power. And so maybe we could put together a book that looks at it. There was no one single source that really traced out women's political journey, especially in the last 100 years. People talked about bits and pieces of it, but we wanted to have a really comprehensive history, and especially of the history in the last 20 years. Almost more than half of the women elected to Congress in the history of America have been elected since 1998. And it's really hard. Leandra and I both teach modern political history. There really weren't many historians writing about women's political history in the 21st century. 20 years, usually historians, we have to sketch back at least 50 years to feel like it's real history. But we wanted to have a historical book that we could assign to our classes when talking about, the past 20 plus years. And so we thought it was especially important for recent political history to put together this collection. Of course, we only had 2 years to put it together. So the prospect of the two of us going into the archives and writing the whole book ourselves, it just wouldn't happen. Especially, I know like famous people write books and they put it together in 6 months, but we historians, we need like years to research it. Our first books both took about 10 years. So we said, there's no way we can write it together. How about we do a collection where we put out a call to historians, and she and I, Leandra and I, we would write a very comprehensive essay at the beginning of the book, just really sketching out that path of women in politics since getting a vote. And then we would invite historians all around the country, the world actually, to contribute anything they could about women in American politics since 1920. And that's really what we did. We put out a call on all the appropriate history channels, and we were just shocked and delighted with the proposals that came in. And we put together this collection, and there's just so many great stories. And another thing we really wanted to make sure is that this was, although it's an academic press because no one else wanted to publish us, the big presses, we did want this to be something that could be used in the classroom for undergraduate and graduate students, but we also really wanted this to be something that the general public could read. Leandra and I both do a lot of writing in the new history section for the Washington Post, and it's, more people read us those articles than anything we'd ever write in academia. So we really wanted it to be a book that anyone could enjoy. And so it has 20 articles, all about different aspects of women in American politics, preceded by this comprehensive article that Leandra and I wrote, sort of sketching out that whole history. It takes about 5 to 10 minutes to read one of the articles, and I think so much of it is so timely and so interesting. And we're really hoping it's received a lot of interest just because of the centennial and historic numbers of women running for office. But we really hope that people enjoy it as much as we enjoyed putting it together.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting process, and I don't think a lot of people do realize how much research goes behind a book like this, that you want to make sure to get all viewpoints and all the information in there accurately. And real quick before I go on to the next book, something I should have mentioned at the very beginning, for anybody that's local, the bookstore in Ridgewood, Bookends, has several copies of Stacy's book available with her autograph in it. If you'd like to contact them, I can send the information in the chat so that you can have their website and phone number accessible to you. So you can have it shipped to you or pick it up from the bookstore yourself. They do curbside as well as you can go into the store. And you can also purchase it on Amazon. And if you use Amazon Smile, which is a fundraising feature of Amazon, you can put in the Friends of the Ridgewood Public Library, and then some of the donation, there's a donation that goes to the Friends of the Ridgewood Public Library as well. So it is available in multiple stores. So please feel free to pick up a book as well. And not to take book sales away, but there is always a copy here at the Ridgewood Library for you to borrow. And we have one in the archive because we like to maintain a collection of local authors. So on to the next question. Before we get into the argument of the book in its entirety, just where are women in politics 100 years after the 19th Amendment? After the women's suffrage amendment was ratified? And are you limiting women's politics to just winning electoral office?
Yeah, so that's a question we often get. In the book, when we're sketching out the last 100 years of women in American electoral office, because if we did that, we wouldn't have much to write about. For so long, women were in the trenches behind the scenes and were not able to be elected readily to political office. So we define women's politics very broadly. A lot of it is women behind the scenes. We'll get to why when we get to the argument. But a very timely question. I actually, if you have that graphic I shared, this is a question we're getting a lot. So where are women in American politics? Clearly, unless you're living under a rock, that women have broken the hardest, highest glass ceiling, as Hillary Clinton referred to it, by moving into executive power with the election of our first ever female vice president, Kamala Harris. So that's a very big historic achievement, obviously. Congress is not the only metric of women in politics, but it's often an important one, and it often correlates to what you see in state legislatures as well. So at this moment, of course, they're still counting, as we all know, they're still tabulating some of the races. And I think I last refreshed at 4 o'clock and there were maybe like 15 races with women that were not yet called in the House. But right now we have more women were just elected than ever before, but you can see that before last Tuesday's election, women comprised 23.7% of Congress. That's both chambers of Congress. And now after Tuesday, they're 25.2. So, that's some progress there. You see Democrats actually lost a couple seats, 3 if you're going by the 2018 midterms. Republicans actually, there was an acknowledgement after 2018 when more women than ever before were elected. And obviously we're talking, the most women ever elected in the Democratic Party in 2018. There was an acknowledgement among Republicans that they really needed to play catch up. So they put out a lot of women in races in 2020, and they actually, so far we know 32 were elected, which beats the prior record of 30 Republican women, which was set in 2006. But of course, you do see a disparity there. Even though Democrats lost women, there are 103 women serving in this next Congress on the Democratic side. Probably a few more will be added, and for Republicans, it's 32. So it's an interesting time at this centennial to be always asked, so where are women in American politics? We are further than we've ever been before, but a quarter is not 50-50 gender parity. We always go back to in 1971 at the height of the modern women's movement, as women and women legislators were passing groundbreaking legislation like Title IX that really amplified women and girls sports and educational opportunity. and they're passing credit card reform and so many of the laws that today we just all take for granted. There was an acknowledgement among feminists that they needed to move into political office if they really wanted to be able to effectively pass legislation rather than relying on male legislators to do their legislative bidding. So in 1971, they formed the National Women's Political Caucus to fundraise for and elect more women to office. And it was a bipartisan effort, Democrats and Republicans. And sitting in 1971, they set a goal of 50-50 gender parity by the centennial in 2020. And that they really didn't think that was going to be hard to get to. It's 1971, they're passing all these laws, and they envision that, yeah, by the centennial in 2020, half of Congress will be women. So as you see, we're further than we've ever been, but we're still at a quarter, and we're still marking firsts, right? Like Speaker of the House, the first female vice president. We want to celebrate these things, but that's exactly one woman in executive power and in this entire nation's history. So I'm optimistic, especially, trends are sort of leading towards more support for women in American politics, but I'm also very clear-eyed about the history that we sketch out in this book. And so I'm also, I can understand why we're so far behind men.
Yeah, no, it is interesting to see the numbers change, and it is always exciting, but like you said, we're not quite at that goal. Why are women where they are in politics today gaining ground, but still not at that 50-50 gender parity with men? In other words, what is the story of women in American politics since 1920, if you can summarize that?
So the best I can say is that, this is a country that is formed, it's a democracy, a constitutional republic that's formed with a lot of rhetoric about equality and equal representation. But of course, so much of that is really that rhetoric. This was a democracy that was set up by and for wealthier white men wealthier white men. And we can still feel the repercussions of that fact today. When the founding fathers were setting up this democracy and, excluding women, writing slavery in, despite this sort of rhetoric about democracy, they were pressed about women and women's inclusion. Of course, famously, I always have my students read the letters that Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, John, as he went to Philadelphia to write the Constitution. And she famously wrote, actually, she really threatened him. She said, John, don't forget the ladies. And if you do, you men are going to run this experiment into the ground, she more or less said. Well, John and the other founders, they forgot the ladies, and women did not get the vote. The concession was, they basically said, you ladies don't need the vote. It's really like a family vote when your husband goes out to the polls. And furthermore, you're the moral guardians of the home. Politics is corrupt, backroom deals, and you women are too moral. And if we let you go into that corrupt political arena, there'll be no center of morality. Men are supposed to go out there, make these deals, and then come home and their wives, morality will somehow wash them of any of that immorality in the public sphere. And they also said, if you really want to make a change in America, you can raise your sons to be the next leaders of America in the vision that you want for the country. Now, of course, this idea, Republican motherhood is what it was called, was only extended to wealthier white women like the Abigail Adams. And, good for Abigail, her son, John Quincy, actually did become a president, right? So that worked for her. This vision, women belong in the home, raising America's next leaders, it only applied to wealthier white women, enslaved women, working class women, women who weren't white. The founders didn't envision their sons being the next leaders of America. So that notion that women's politics is tied to domesticity, being in the home, and motherhood, raising men, that has really plagued women since the beginning of time. Women, asked outright for equality at things like the first women's convention at Seneca Falls in 1848. They basically said, we're not more moral than men. We can handle the public sphere of voting. And so let us in. And those calls were never met well. They were never realized. So sooner or later, women started saying things like, yeah, we get it. We belong in the home. Please just give us the vote so that we can more effectively pass legislation for women and children, you know, sort of our lane, domesticity and motherhood. And, you know, in the end, those calls didn't even work for getting women the right to vote. It was sort of positioned as a measure of democracy around World War I. Women finally got the right to vote. But that history, it didn't go away, right? So just because women got the right to vote, it doesn't mean suddenly men in 1920, or they got the constitutional right to vote. Doesn't mean that men all of a sudden, you know, cleared the way and said, let's make Congress 50-50 by any stretch of the imagination, right? So, sorry, sorry, I don't know if I hear some background noise, I'm sorry. Yeah, so women get the right to vote, and basically no one wants to elect them to office. Most of the women elect, there's two tracks of what happens. Only really white women can exercise the right to vote in 1920 in a large scale way. And so those women who are voting, white women, they struggle to run for office. And actually the only ones really being elected to office are often widows. There was a great quote in 1925, a newspaper publisher wrote something like, the best ticket to Congress, better than a log cabin, is a dead husband for women. You know, historically, women are in politics to represent their husbands. And so the only reason to elect them is when that husband dies, so that she can be a placeholder for her husband until his advisors can find another man to take her spot. So for white women, it was really, they really struggled to translate that voting power into political power because of the way that this democracy was set up. And they were really only effective in passing legislation. The men on Capitol Hill would only listen to them when they passed legislation related to women and children. For women who weren't white, the 19th Amendment did not represent getting the vote. It represented just another point in a constant struggle to get the vote. You know, Black women in particular in the Jim Crow South, they actually initially voted in the thousands in the early 1920s. And again, they kind of used gender to their favor. Of course, you know, the Ku Klux Klan and white segregationists in the South, they were very alarmed if Black men were trying to exercise their right to vote because men are supposed to be of politics, right? So that's why Black men's voting was shut down pretty quickly after Reconstruction. But Black women initially were allowed, many of them in the thousands, to register to vote because the thinking was, they're just women. They're not really going to like run for office and lead in any way. Of course, that was quickly shut down, but the story for women who weren't white after 1920 was a constant struggle to get the vote, and you know, Native American women didn't get it until 1924 with the Snyder Act, and Black women, especially in the Jim Crow South, didn't get it until the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So it's really an uneven start. We really start to see in the 1970s, on the heels of the civil rights movement and you know, an expansion of the voting public. That's when we start to see an uptick in women starting to run for office and starting to pass legislation. But again, it's a very uneven path, and we're always struck by the fact that, you know, feminists really underestimated the backlash to the modern feminist movement. That was the sort of the subject of my first book. And so, you know, in 1970, there are actually more, at the height of the women's movement, there are actually more women in Congress than there are in 1980, as some white women like Phyllis Schlafly start mobilizing against modern feminism. So that's always a statistic that I'm struck by. So it's been an uneven history, and it's been easier for white women. But I think even today, the fact that this was a system set up by and for wealthier white men of means that for so long, only those men could vote and run for office. And this is what Leandra and I call the white male political ideal. I think as a result, it became cemented in Americans' minds that the typical, the normal political leader or politician is a white man. And of course, you know, you maybe could arguably say that you saw the results of that in the 2020 Democratic primary, right? At a moment when the party thought they were sort of at rock, really in a moment of crisis with the 2016 election of Donald Trump. You know, they had a huge primary with more women, 8 women running in it, a very diverse, the most diverse sampling of candidates. And in the end, a white man came out on top, you know, when people thought, you know, no, this time the party really needs to win office. So who do you put in? You know, a lot of that has to relate with this history we're sketching out.
I had a question come in that's similar to something else I was going to ask, so I'm going to combine them if that's okay. They're very similar. So are there any particular women's voices or stories in the book that you'd like to highlight?
Sure.
And then the question that came in from Kristen is, what chapter findings surprised you the most? So.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so there are 20 chapters, other than Leandra, this 100-year history, there are 20 other chapters, and there's some great, I mean, you know, when we put out that call, if you can write about anything about women in American politics since 1920, we're interested in potentially having your article in our book. We were really just so surprised with the stories that came in. And, you know, here we are, political historians. There were just some things we never had heard of. You know, one really great thing I told you that this collection is one of the only ones that really consider the articles in particular. One, Sarah Rowley, she's a professor at DePaul University, and she writes about political husbands. And I think there's a lot of attention, you know, with the first vice president, female vice president elect, you know, there's a lot of talk about Kamala Harris's husband, Doug, right? You know, what will we call him? How do we view him? And so Sarah Rowley, this is just something, having studied the 1970s, and this really surprised Leandra and me. You know, we were both studying women in American politics in the 70s for a decade or more across the political spectrum. And we know that more women started to be elected in small numbers to Congress in the 1970s at the height of the women's movement. And I do mean small numbers. In 1972, the best year for women in the 1970s, 5 women were elected to Congress. But one thing Leandra and I had never thought of was their husbands, right? So if historically most women elected to Congress were widows, you know, obviously they didn't have a husband, and they were there to be as a place marker for their husband who had passed away. There was all this attention in the 1970s. I just really love her article about what to make of these women who run in their own right. All 5 of them are lawyers who are elected in 1972. And, you know, Congress just doesn't know what to make of their husbands, right? Because they have all these traditions that are for political spouses. Well, it's, you know, those are designed with women in mind, you know, teas, and they're also designed with the idea that the political spouse doesn't hold her own paid job, right? So they really, Congress and, you know, the media and everyone really just struggles, you know, what do we do with these husbands? They're coming to Washington and they're keeping their jobs, and they're, you know, they're performing a lot of childcare because their wives are in Congress. So that's a really great article. And it just, I don't know, just like surprised us, because we'd written so much about the women that we kind of forgot, we too forgot about their husbands. So Sarah actually wrote something in that history section of the Washington Post with that history in mind, looking at how we can think about the first, or I guess the second gentleman, the first second gentleman coming into executive power. Another thing that I think is really in the news today is one of our authors, Ellen Rafshoon. She writes about women in the suburbs of Georgia, basically those perimeter suburbs north of Atlanta in particular, Cobb, DeKalb counties and such that we're hearing about so much in the news the past week. She writes about suburban women who organized after 2016. So we're talking really recent history, who organized after 2016 and being upset about Trump being elected. And, you know, they form all these groups that are, you know, perimeter progressives, indivisible, groups that are really responsible for electing Lucy McBath in Georgia's 6th district in 2018. And she was just reelected. And so that's a great article. I mean, you know, obviously we think Georgia flipped to the Democrats, and we say there are two reasons why, right? Like Stacey Abrams organizing and getting people who didn't vote in 2016 or had never been registered to vote to be registered and to vote, and especially that real work she did with you know, in the African American community. And then we also point towards suburban women of all races in those suburbs. So, you know, Ellen Rafshoon's article really kind of explains what we mean by those suburbs flipping and the work that women did to flip those suburbs. There's also a great, I mean, I could talk about all 20 of these, but I guess with recent events in mind, you know, with the deserved attention of Stacey Abrams, we have a great article by Liette Gidlow about the equivalent of Stacey Abrams' organization in the 1920s. Stacey Abrams was working in a long tradition of Black women trying to register people to vote and get out the vote. And so Liette Gidlow's article talks about some of those foremothers that really grounded the work that Stacey Abrams' organization is doing today. So that's just a few of the things that surprised me or really interested me.
Yeah. So there's probably a lot. It's a bit of a book to cover, and very quickly is which one's your favorite. So thank you for that. I do want to ask also about the gender parity in politics. As we've been talking about tonight, we are not at that 50-50 gender parity in American politics. What do you think would be different, if anything, if we were?
Yeah, you know, we're always asked this question because, you know, women for so long have set that goal of 50-50 representation. You know, we're always asked, well, what do you think would change if it were 50-50? And our answer, just honestly, we're not good at predicting the future, we historians, is I don't know, but I really hope we find out. I mean, you know, people will say things like, you know, Nancy Pelosi is an amazingly effective Speaker of the House. And I think regardless of what your politics are, you have to agree that she is one of the most effective speakers of the House we've ever had, in terms of she has her party's agenda and she is able to whip a vote like none other and get that agenda through. It's very effective. But then can we say, you know, all women would be great speakers of the House based on a sample size of one? No, we can't, right? We also have to realize that more women elected doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, unrealized goals of the modern women's movement are necessarily going to pass, right? I mean, just in this most recent election, you know, the biggest uptick was on the Republican side, and it included a woman who identifies with QAnon. She ran in one of the most conservative districts in the country in Georgia, ran unopposed. But, you know, more women doesn't necessarily mean that federally subsidized childcare is going to pass. And, you know, that's something I'm very conscious of, because having studied the backlash to the modern women's movement as long as I've studied it. So I'm not really sure. I mean, women have historically presented themselves as the people who can come in and clean up the mess. You know, they did this after Watergate, for example. They did this after the Clinton impeachment. They did it again in 2018. But, you know, some of that rhetoric historically, we are women, we can clean up. isn't always, something they believe truly. In a lot of cases, especially historically, women have had to make claims like that because it's the only way men would listen. When women said we want equality and we want equal representation and we want to lead alongside men, given the history of our democracy, those claims historically have not gone well for women at the polls. So, given that women historically have had their politics linked with domesticity, women have long made claims like where women let us in to clean things up. So it's not necessarily a sure thing that they would actually come in and make politics run a little more smoothly. Those are just claims that had to make. So I really don't know what would happen if we had 50-50 representation, but I really hope I see it in my lifetime, and we can find out.
Let's hope we do find out, because I'd like to see what would happen as well. So along those lines, where are we now then? What lessons from the past 100 years should we be thinking about in our current political moment?
One thing I'll say, and I'm celebrating these wins alongside a lot of people, is that historically, when women have seen an uptick, well, women who support some of the goals of the modern feminist movement, legal abortion, federally funded childcare, equal pay for women, to name a few. Historically, when women have organized at the grassroots level, they have been highly effective in being elected to office and trying to push forth that agenda. But it has also in some ways often inspired other women who do not agree with those things to run for office and oppose them. And I think maybe in these numbers from 2020, we see a little bit of that. The major surge in women elected in 2018 were Democratic women who supported many of these things that are part of the modern women's rights movement. And, Republicans obviously oppose a lot of those things. And there was historically, this happened in the 70s, and it looks like it could have happened to a little bit of a degree in this past election. Republicans have traditionally noticed, like, okay, a lot of women are being elected and they're passing sort of big government things that conservative Republicans don't like. We need to oppose them, but it's probably better to try to run conservative women to oppose these things, because you don't want to look like men are trying to squash women's rights. If you can have a conservative woman out there doing it, you can claim it has nothing to do with women's rights. It's just about a fight over the size of government. So I do think that historic waves of feminist women often beget historic upticks in anti-feminist women. And I think maybe we saw some of that in the past 2 years, a version of what happened in the 1970s. Again, that's one of the reasons that at the dawn of the 1970s, when you're having all this legislation passed and women in historic numbers are being elected to Congress and below, you end the decade with the sort of family values coalition of Ronald Reagan and fewer women, and certainly fewer feminist women in power. So on that depressing it.
On that note, I guess.
But celebrate more than ever. But I do want to say that I do think it's enormously important for women to occupy new territory. And I think in particular, we've never had anyone in executive power. And I think there's an enormous opportunity for Kamala Harris at the highest level of our government to just get out there. And if she really is a true partner to President Biden, as Biden was to Obama, if she's really able to share power and just get out there and sort of the normal ceremonial and real sort of meat and potatoes part of the executive role, I think she will start to help normalize the idea of a woman, and especially a woman of color, being in the highest reaches of government. I think she will be helping to clear a path for those after her. And historically, that's what's happened. Once a woman occupies an office, the first woman to be governor, that helps normalize executive power for women in a system that historically power has been male. So it's important.
important, and it'll be very interesting to see how it works out. So looking at the present and to the future, how has the coronavirus and the blending of work and home created some new challenges and possibly offered new opportunities for women as well?
Yeah, I mean, the blending of work and home, I'm like crossing my fingers that a puppy or two children don't come running in here. And I think a lot of women and men understand, since we're doing everything at home these days. I do think, for women, because of this being a country historically sort of set up for men politically. As a result, women, for example, still don't have equal pay. So I think the coronavirus in some ways has been very damaging to women because of this unequal pay. A lot of families with two working parents have had to have a parent scale back some of the work because you lost your childcare and your children are you're educating your children are home all the time and you don't have childcare. And I have seen, just personally and also statistically across the country, that it's a lot of women who are having to step back from their careers and in the coronavirus because often they made less. So if someone's going to have to scale back, it'll have to be the one who's paid less. So, in that way, I see this current environment very damaging to women because we really hadn't attained equality. On the other hand, this blending of home and work, it's also given an opportunity for women at home, since we're all working from home, to start a lot of creative businesses at home. If you go on Etsy, you have a lot of women-owned businesses that are new and often catering towards this pandemic, making masks or whatnot. So it's also with women in the home, it's also offered them an opportunity to find new forms of income and new forms of work right in the home, but it's also been damaging. So I think it's sort of a mixed bag for women, but I definitely think that this has highlighted some of the things that people have long talked about, like the need for well-paid childcare and the need to fund public schools. And of course, with women disproportionately working in K-12 schools and also in childcare facilities, I think people have a new appreciation for how hard this is. And so maybe that will lead to better pay and better work conditions for the women who often labor in those places.
It's been interesting and difficult and rewarding. It's the work from home experience has changed everybody's perspective, I think. I'm going to stop sharing the screen just so I can very easily see some of these questions that have come in, because thank you so much for everybody for submitting, and thank you, Stacy, for answering my questions. But I'm going to now turn it over to the audience. So I'm going to go with the first question that came from Carolyn. Is there a source that lists women in major elective U.S. positions such as governors, mayors, senators, representatives?
Yes, and it is local. Rutgers, their Center for Women in American Politics, you just Google that, Women in Politics, Rutgers. They are the best at tracking that, and you can drill down to even maybe not the local level, but they definitely track women's congressional representation, their representation in state office, federal office. And so I would point folks to that site, Rutgers Center for Women in American Politics, for some of it. And that actually, that graphic I shared was from that site. And I should have said that because I always want my students to cite their sources.
We all fall into that trap at some point. And then Beth says, this is an easy question. What's kept the US from electing a female president? I'm not sure that's easy, Beth.
Well, no, I mean, I really do think that in a political system that was set up by and for wealthier white men, and for so long, those were the only folks who could vote in some cases and thus run for political office. It really normalized this, what we're calling the white male political ideal. If, for so long, those in political power have been white men, that sort of, yeah, really normalizes that, right? So, and you know, you see it in this history that we sketch out in the book, right? Like white women have an easier time than women who aren't white in you know, in voting and trickling into political office because they have the privilege of whiteness, right? But they're behind because they're women. Women who aren't white are sort of have what activists, for instance, Beale once called double jeopardy, right? They are behind in politics because of their race and because of their gender, right? So I do think that it's really that preference, right? And in times of crisis, you know, people think the safe thing is the white man, right? And I really think like you saw a lot of that articulated in the 2020 primary just most recently, right? When a real time for the Democratic Party, which they saw as crisis, with Donald Trump in office. And, you know, the thinking was, even though 8 women ran, a historic number, even though a woman, you know, won the popular vote last time, maybe it's too risky to give him another term and to put a man, to put a woman in, right? So I think that, you know, I am hopeful because, like I said, the more women run for office and especially run for extremely high levels of office, the more it normalizes it. I mean, you can just even think of when he becomes President Biden, when he's giving a State of the Union, there are going to be 2 women behind him, right? Because the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, assuming she says she wants to run, so assuming she runs and wins, but I'm assuming that, and the Vice President, right? Vice President Harris. And I just think even like subtle things like that matter. And, you know, I think women are starting to gain some traction. And historically, they've had to do it at the grassroots, right? Like they've never had power at the top. So they've only been able to work from the grassroots. But you can just look at, and, you know, some of the articles, especially in the latter part of the book, really just talk about the amazing multiracial, cross-class organizing that women have been doing that have brought forth these historic gains in 2018 and 2020. So I'm really hopeful. You know, basically you could say it started at the Women's March in 2017, and then it led to 2 consecutive cycles of historic numbers of women being elected. And so I'm hopeful, but really it's taken us a long time because of that history. And the only way we are getting progress is to work from the bottom up, given that we've been so far behind. So I really think that's why. But I do think that once we've broken the VP barrier, it's going to be a lot easier to just envision it. And, you know, we have also a great article. We have 2 articles on, we have an article in 2008 with Sarah Palin and Hillary Clinton. And then we have another article in the latter half of the book on Hillary Clinton in 2016 and her wearing white and the tributes to suffragists. By the way, I should note, I'm sure many of you noticed that Vice President-elect Kamala Harris had on her suffrage white when she gave her speech on Saturday. But, you know, one thing that those articles about Clinton in particular track is you even saw it easier for her to run for president in 2016 than it was in 2008, in the sense that in 2008, she had to do a lot of work to just appear tough, like a commander in chief, right? And arguably she voted for the Iraq War in 2003, so she looked like a strong, you know, commander in chief. And you saw her in 2016, and that's Nicole Eden. She has an article in the book about this. You know, you saw her able to embrace history and women's history and not try to enter, you know, try to play on the same turf as men and look like a strong executive in 2016. So I really think like she herself broke new ground for women in 2008. And when she ran for president, Hillary Clinton 8 years later, she didn't, you know, she had already helped normalize the notion of a woman running for president such that she didn't have to as visibly present herself in the same manner as men do in politics. So yeah, we're getting there.
And the next question is, do you think that there were men who were actually afraid of the power of women?
Yeah, I mean, you know, if there's the reverse is also true. Like if this is a system of government that is set up by and for white men, and the message to women is you belong in the home. You know, a lot of women just internalize that, right? And but often I will say that, you know, claims that we want less political power because we think it will upset our ability to be mothers, often that is, it intersects with like racist politics, right? Like, so for example, there were plenty of women who opposed their own suffrage in leading up to 1920. And why did they oppose it? They went out publicly on the record and said, we can't have the vote. It's going to make us, you know, less effective in the home if we're out in the male political sphere. Well, actually, a lot of those women didn't want the right to vote, because if women got the right to vote, and these were white Anglo-Saxon Protestant women, that would mean all women got the right to vote. And a lot of those women lived in the Northeast, where that, you know, you had immigrants coming in from Southeast Europe, whom they did not consider white, whom they did not consider to be on par with them. And so one of the reasons they opposed suffrage is because those inferior immigrant women would get the vote, and there were more of them than there were white Anglo-Saxon Protestant women. So women have definitely made claims that we don't want power, we belong in the home, but sometimes that's a smokescreen for you know, trying to preserve white privilege. So it's difficult to disentangle. I mean, I, of course, for my dissertation turned first book, I interviewed the most prolific anti-feminist, Phyllis Schlafly, for that book. And, you know, Phyllis Schlafly often used that rhetoric, like, we can't have more women's rights, we belong in the home. I have to oppose the Equal Rights Amendment because it'll be very upset, it would be terrible for homemakers like I am. Except she really wasn't a homemaker. She was running one of the most sophisticated political operations in America. Phyllis Schlafly was in the 70s. So, you know, a lot of that rhetoric is often sometimes said with a mind towards having men listen to them and grant them more power, or to prefer preserving racial privilege. So yeah. I'm not sure women are actually afraid of having more political power, but they've certainly made that argument.
And then another question is, how can we now encourage women to vote for the candidate of their choice rather than voting along with their husbands, boyfriends, etc.?
Well, you can direct them to, you know, wonderful, I see Eileen Kahn here, wonderful events put on by the local League of Women Voters, where they level on upwards so that they can form their own opinions. I do think, though, as more women are visibly in political power, again, they will be normalizing this idea that politics is not just a male space, it's a space for both sexes. And maybe that would then in turn encourage women to realize that their own opinions should matter, right? I mean, I guess I've never really met a woman who deferred to a husband but of course, historically, that was the case. And in fact, the system was set up with the thinking that your husband will represent what, you know, he'll do your bidding in office. I mean, in the voting booth. So, you know, I just really do to just, even if subtly, encourage women to realize that this is a space for women too.
We have a few more questions. Hopefully we can get to them all. This one you sort of already kind of covered. So does this election put Hillary's loss to Trump in a different context, give it a new twist?
I mean, it certainly highlights, you know, this much better in the exact area. But I mean, I think that in general, the reverse could be true, that maybe if you didn't have her loss, such a narrow loss, right, then we never would have had the women's movement, right? And we wouldn't have had then potentially historic wave of elections for women in 2018 and 2020. So, you know, in some sense, some of this amazing organizing that, you know, just won the Democratic Party, the suburbs of Atlanta, a lot of that's women. on the ground, flipping that state. And so, I do think that in many ways her loss really cleared the path for, for all that organizing to the point where Joe Biden was certain that he needed to put a woman on his ticket, right?
Yeah.
In order to be elected in a party that was being mobilized by women on the ground.
Yeah. And along those lines, another question regarding the current climate. Somebody wrote in, my daughter attends Ramapo College and says that the boys in her poli-sci classes are largely Republican Trump supporters. How do you navigate the challenges of being a feminist professor teaching the history of suffrage in a climate where plenty of young people are conservative, even anti-feminist?
Oh, yeah. Well, luckily, I'm not seeing a lot of that in the political history classes that her daughter's seeing in the political science ones. I do remember, though, very clearly, the day of Trump's inauguration, which was, January 20th, it was a Friday, and then the Women's March was the next day. I do remember in my Gender, Race, and American Politics, I walked in, it was the first class, and right in the front row was a male student with a Make America Great sweatshirt on and hat. So, that was really my only experience, sort of seeing that at Ramapo. But I mean, listen, as a historian, I mean, try to take our own politics out of it. And that's the same way I try to teach, right? Like, I studied the rise of anti-feminist family values conservatives. Where did I get the idea to study that in graduate school? I had been on the John Kerry campaign in 2004, and that was the family values election. So I had a lot of doors slammed in my face, people telling me that they couldn't vote for Kerry because he was against family values, specifically for legal abortion, which, then I had gone to graduate school planning to write about, I don't know what I claimed in my essay. So then I said, no, I want to understand how family values became correlated with anti-feminist political leanings instead of like, why isn't healthcare or family values? Why is it wanting, abortion illegal, so-called family values? So I just, for my entire career, have studied people whose politics was not what my own politics were, but I actually think that's, it's really important to do that. And so I try to tell my students, this isn't a space for us to just standing why this politics has come into being, right? And that's the same thing when I write about people whose politics I don't agree on. I just want to tell the story, right? In many ways, there's a lot to admire about the family values, right? They certainly, for a good 40 years, dominated American politics. So I wanted to tell that story. So tell your daughter to come over to political history. And there we have really, I honestly don't necessarily even know my students' political leanings, because this is a space for us to study the development of these political fights that dominate our lives today. We want to understand and unpack that history. And, we don't want to, this isn't a debate about our thoughts and feelings.
Yeah. All right. So there's a few comments just saying thank you and whatnot. So if anybody has any final questions, please feel free to write it in now. If not, thank you so much, Stacy. This was very interesting. It's always fascinating to see the history behind these things. As Stacy said, it's best to understand it as a whole and learn a lot more about it. So again, you can get, I sent it in the chat. I hope everybody has my email since I sent out the information on the Zoom. So if you have questions on how to purchase Stacy's book, either from Bookends with the signed copy, through Amazon Smiles, or again, like I said, we do have a couple copies here at the Ridgewood Library, so take them out as well. And thank you. We have one more question, I guess. Why are there so many less female Republicans in Congress than Democrats? And we'll end on that question. Easy,
Uh,
right?
well, I have a great book for you to read, my first book. But basically the modern Republican Party, a big pillar of what it became today, was anti-feminism, right? So as the party shed its former support for feminism, Republicans when they were dominated by the likes of Nelson Rockefeller, they were for things like legal abortion. When they decided to make anti-feminism a core part of that really took away a lot of the women from the party, right? It became harder to run as a woman on an explicitly anti-women's rights platform, like just for obvious reasons, right? And so they had trouble attracting women. If a core tenet is women belong in the home, which is a core tenet of that family values politics in many ways. If a core tenet is that government should be as small as possible, then it's not exactly a great environment for women to leave their homes and go work in government, right? So that's the really short answer, but it wasn't always that way. And like I said, at the real height of the modern women's movement, when the National Women's Political Caucus was founded, you saw feminists in pretty much equal proportion in both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And that was a bipartisan effort. But then as the Democratic Party moved leftward, it started to embrace modern feminism as a means to do that. And as the Republican Party moved rightward to become sort of the family values party of Reagan, anti-feminism, they saw fewer women starting to run for office. And those who did, of course, were supporting an agenda that didn't really attract a lot of female support in some cases. So that's a very short answer.
Difficult to provide those short answers to large context questions, but I think you did a fantastic job with that. And again, thank you so much for talking about your book. This was fascinating. I hope everybody enjoyed their night. And definitely, I sent the link to Bookends again. Here's what for Amazon Smile. Again, if you purchase it through that, you can put it'll put a donation to the Friends of the Ridgewood Public Library. And I hope you all will join us for future events. The month of December is a little quiet for the Bulger Heritage Center, but we'll be picking up with some other programs in January and February. So always check our website. And we offer a lot of different events for the adult community. We have a crafting program, Real Voices with different movies that are important to have discussions on. So make sure to check out all of our events and check out Stacy's book. And we hope to see you again soon. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks for taking time. Thanks again, Sarah, and to the Bulger Center and Ridgewood Library.
Happy to have you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.